On today's show, we have our guest, David Gold, and we're going to be talking about some very unusual things in American history. Anything from eugenics to the history of African Americans. David Gold?
Well, you had asked me a little bit about the curious character of American slavery.
Yep.
There are many different forms of slavery around the world. I've recently been reading about slavery in the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Ottomans would go and take Greeks and Romanians and Serbs and bring them into the Janissary as slaves. But you could actually work your way out of that over 7 years or so. And you might, if you had the ability, get a decent education as well. American slavery was peculiar in that it was typical in American slavery to sell families away from each other, particularly to sell the man away from the husband and father, away from his wife and his children. This is a marked, distinct character in American slavery. And think of it, it's unbelievable. Slavery itself is sort of beyond our imagination. But then the idea that you would take a father and a husband and remove him from the other part of the family and wouldn't allow them to live on the same place or see each other. It's horrific. One of the remarkable things that so galvanized my attention when I lived in Chicago in the 60s was when I learned about the Aid to Dependent Children, which was the welfare program in the state of Illinois, and learned that the welfare system continued this process. In the Aid to Dependent Children, which was the only welfare you could get in the 60s, a mother and her children, she could apply for some state support if she needed it. But a requirement was that there was no man in the house. So what was striking to me is that how fathers who would be committed to their families, they often, in that period in Chicago, they often would had to work at a very, very menial job, often in the suburbs, where it cost transportation to get back and forth. And if they cared enough about their children and their wife, they were obliged to leave the home so that the family could get a bit more money than they could make. So it's horrific when you think of it, that you can construct a modern welfare program using a model from slavery, which is targeted deliberately to destroy relationship, and particularly the relationship between men and their wives and their children. This has been corrected to some extent, but it's something to be alert to, because we very easily can slip into that way of thinking about things.
There's also some interesting history with the women's right to vote and the famous five. They were into eugenics. Is this true?
Well, the famous five, some of them come from Alberta, were a remarkable group of women who had taken the bull by the horns and who did all of that extraordinary work to see that women got the franchise, that women could vote. We don't think of this a lot these days, I suppose, but this is extremely significant for a democratic society. And it's significant in so many, many ways. And I think it also eases a burden for men, because it's not right for men to assume the total authority of anything.
Agreed.
This is a very problematic matter. So the famous five are very significant in Canadian history for having done that.
Agreed.
But of course, they're part of a larger movement which comes out of Europe as well, which is grounded in a particular kind of philosophical perspective, a particular kind of rationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of rationalism also largely saw human communities that were not white,
Mm-hmm.
and even those that were white, but were not modern. That is, were not involved in the kind of culture of progress
Mm-hmm.
and the industrial society that was developing out of the 19th century. So any communities that were not part of that were deemed inferior. They were simply inferior. So here in Alberta, as an example, we had a large body of Ukrainian and other Eastern Europeans who settled on the prairies from Manitoba on through Alberta, a big swath. And it was pretty common for the men in those communities, who were very good farmers, to end up learning English within a relatively short period of time, because they had to go to the local United Grain Growers and deliver their wheat, things of that nature. But it was also quite common for women in those communities to remain at home and a little more incubated within their own Ukrainian or Slavic cultural world. So many of them didn't learn English as quickly as the men did. And one of the things that happened is that they would end up being pregnant or ill in some fashion, go to the Royal Alec Hospital, and a decision would be made to tie their tubes without asking them or necessarily informing them. Now, it wasn't just them, it was them. It was also First Peoples, Indigenous people, as well as people who had mental disabilities. They were all lumped together because it was assumed that these three groups were not participating, could not participate in the new economic order. That new economic order has as its root a notion of progress and a notion of reason, which is deeply part of the West, the modern West, and the way in which it thinks about things. So it appears in some sense kind of ironic that on the one hand, these remarkable women would make this extraordinary contribution to the civil society of Canada. But as we all know, there's dark sides to everything. And the dark side, coming out of the same philosophical worldview, was that a very large swath of the human family was deemed unproductive and not to be given normal rights.